In this video, I'm going to be installing a KTM OEM Kickstarter kit to my 2021 300 TPI. Starting from 2020 TPI models, KTM and Husqvarna stopped fitting a Kickstarter standard, and as you can see here, there's a cover in place on my 2021 TPI where the Kickstarter would normally be. The possible reasons I can think of why KTM stopped fitting the Kickstarter as standard is probably number one is cost. So the kit is not inexpensive, so they're obviously always looking for cost savings. Probably number two is weight. I measured the weight at 670 grams, so I'll show a bit of video later with that. The weight is down pretty low, so I don't think it really makes that much difference, but catalog specs are always important and low weight is more attractive. And probably number three is most people don't use the Kickstarter that much. The e-start is very reliable, and most of the time it works well, so probably those three reasons are the main ones, I think. So what are the benefits or reasons for fitting the Kickstarter? If the e-start works and you don't need to use the Kickstarter, what's the point? Well, if the e-start works, yeah, there isn't much point because it's much easier than kickstarting. But there are occasions where the e-start does not work well. For example, in winter weather, sub-zero conditions, the lithium battery voltage can get low when the bike is cold, and it can sometimes prove difficult to start the bike using e-start. So that's one condition. The other is obviously if the e-start system fails due to a battery problem, or electrical problem, or mechanical issue, in which case having a Kickstarter is very handy. One important thing to be aware of is if the battery is completely dead, the TPIs will not start and run, either by kick-starting or bump starting. You need a capacitor connected for it to be able to start and run. Some of the models do come fitted standard with a capacitor, so that includes the KTM XE model and the Husqvarna TX model. But if you have an EXC or an XEW or a TE model, you'll need to fit a capacitor if you want to be able to start and run the bike when the battery is dead. If being able to start and run your bike with a completely dead battery is important to you and it doesn't come fitted stock with a capacitor, I do sell these BLS capacitor kits on the Tokyo Off-Road web shop. I'll put a link in the description of the video. So the capacitor connects directly to the battery terminals and make sure you get the polarity correct, and then you can leave it connected permanently. And then if the battery goes dead, you can bump start the bike, no problem with just the capacitor. If you want to be able to kickstart it reliably as well, I recommend connecting the pre-charge harness, which is an option. And that allows for connection of a 9-volt battery to pre-charge the capacitor to a high enough voltage that kickstarting becomes easy and reliable. I do recommend that you only connect a 9-volt battery when you need it. So keep a fresh battery in your backpack or in the airbox and just connect that if the motorcycle battery goes dead. The harness does have a diode inside it to protect the 9-volt battery from the higher voltage of the motorcycle battery. So protection is not an issue, but I think it's a good idea to keep the battery fresh and not connect one all the time. The kit includes all the parts shown here, plus a gasket for the inner clutch cover and also a gasket for the right-hand side power valve cover. And the kit came with this piece of paper, which explains that you can download the instructions from here by entering the part number on the web page. And in case you're interested, the kit weight is 670 grams. Okay, so let's get on with the install. The first step is to drain the coolant. And on the 21 model, the coolant drain is here. You can spot it easily. It has a copper washer. So just remove that, and you'll find a tiny bit comes out when you remove the bolt. I still have the radiator cap in place. And then you can use a funnel and a container and then remove the radiator cap, and it drains in easily. So after draining the coolant, the next step in the installation guide is to drain the gear oil. And yeah, if you worked on the bike with it upright, you would need to drain the gear oil because there's oil behind here and you need to remove the clutch cover. But if you lean the bike over on its side, you can leave the gear oil in. So that's what I'm going to do. And then after that, it says to remove the engine. And yeah, you definitely don't need to remove the engine. There is a note saying it's optional, and it is definitely optional unless you have a good reason to remove the engine. Other than just fitting the Kickstarter kit, there is no reason. And interestingly, there's a note saying see repair manual on the removal process. And there is no repair manual available to customers to access. Starting from 2020, KTM stopped offering a repair manual to their customers. So that's one gripe I have, and I'm very keen to see KTM start offering that again. Currently it's only available to dealers as an online version through the dealer network. So yeah, the repair manuals have been a really good reference, so I'm keen to get a repair manual for the late bikes as well. Okay, so before I lean the bike over on its side, to make easy access to the large inner clutch cover, I'm going to remove the pipe, the skid plate, and also the rear brake. And one other thing to note is that because you're going to be working on the internal parts of the engine, you definitely want to make sure the bike is clean. So definitely wash it, and then as you go along, if you spot any dirt before you take the clutch cover off, make sure you either use some air or wipe it off carefully. Okay, so I've removed the exhaust system, the rear brake and the skid plate, and now I'm ready to start disassembly. So I'm going to remove this coolant hose first. And next I'm going to remove the exhaust valve cover, and these screws are Torx 25. Be sure to use the correct bit. The next step is to remove the exhaust valve linkage, which is this, and it's held in place with a clip, which can fly off if you're not careful. So I use a cloth, kind of tuck it underneath, which helps stop it flying off. And then a screwdriver, and you can gently pry it up and round, and you can see it there, and then it slides down. So be careful not to lose that. And then you can gently pry off the linkage. It doesn't take much force. Be careful not to mark the case. Next I'm going to remove the water pump cover. So I've already taken one of the bolts out, and I'm going to remove the remaining 2 bolts. And so the top one is a short one, and the bottom one is a long one. And this one was the one with the copper washer. And next I'm going to remove the exhaust valve tension adjuster. So this is just 2 screws, and both the screws are the same length, and then you can remove the adjuster and also the springs. So there's also an auxiliary spring inside it, so make sure you grab that as well. Okay, the next step is to take the inner clutch cover off, which is this cover. It's quite large. You don't need to take this clutch cover off at all. You leave that in place. And there's quite a large number of screws you need to remove, so a total of 12. And as you can see here in the installation guide, it has a order you take them out. So first take out the ones marked 25, and then the ones 26, and then 27 last. And I always make a template like this when removing cover screws, because often they're different lengths, and it can become quite confusing when you go to put it back on if you don't know where they go. So I make this template out of cardboard and put the screws in as I take them out, and then when I go to put it back on, it's very easy. So it only takes a minute. You can save a lot of time making a template. So I'm going to remove the ones marked 25 first. And because it's a large cover, I'm going to do it in a crisscross pattern. Okay, so I've removed all the bolts which are marked 25, so there's 8 of those, and there's one long one and all the others are shorter. And next I'm going to remove the one bolt which is 26. And then last is the 3 bolts marked 27. And that's all of the screws out now. And you can see there's quite a selection of different lengths. Okay, so now I'm ready to remove the inner clutch cover, and you need to remove it and slide it over the linkage. So it comes off pretty easily, and then just carefully slide it up. And you should note that there's 3 dowels, so there's one here, and one over here. And I'm going to remove those so I can keep track of them easily. And then I'm going to remove the gasket as well. And you might have noticed when I took the clutch cover off, some oil started leaking out. So I initially had the bike leant over with the handlebars resting on a work stand, so they were quite high up. So I've now got them on a thin block of wood so that the bike is really leant over, and that's not an issue. So that's something to be aware of. It needs to be leant over quite a bit if you haven't drained the oil. Okay, so in the installation manual, it says to remove the exhaust valve linkage by removing these 2 bolts, but there really is no reason to do that, so I'm going to leave that in place and go on to the next step, which is to remove the clutch. So you start by loosening the belleville spring tensioner, and you want to do that in a crisscross pattern. And take a note of what setting it's on. So mine is on number 2. So it goes 1, 2, 3. And then you can remove the belleville spring. And note there's a washer on here. And it has an orientation with a top marking. So I've just found the top marking on the washer. It's quite small, and unless you're looking for it, you wouldn't really spot it, but the design of the washer is quite different. So the top surface is quite rounded, and the bottom is very sharp. So make sure when you're putting that back in, you get it the right orientation with the top marking up or out. And next I'm going to remove the pressure plate, and this will probably come off with one steel plate. And I've got the throw out as well. And next I'm going to remove the clutch pack. And you want to make sure you don't lose any of these dowels. So be very careful if they drop out, and track where they are. Okay, so I got the majority of the clutch pack out. I think there's still, there's one steel plate there. And my bike has only got 6 hours on it, so the clutch is still in great shape. If you have a lot of hours on your clutch, now is a good time to inspect it and replace it if it needs it. And I have a separate video which goes into detail about inspecting the clutch and replacing it. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one. Okay, the next step is to remove the clutch inner hub, and it's held in place with this nut. And there's a lock washer here, so you have to bend down the tabs of the lock washer before you can remove the nut. So use a screwdriver carefully and just carefully hammer it out. Try not to use too much force. And then you can bend it down. And to hold the inner clutch basket in place while loosening the nut, you need a tool. I made this tool out of clutch plates welded together, and using the dowels here, it holds the inner clutch basket in place. Very safe method to use because the force is distributed at 6 points. If you don't have a tool like this, you can use a tool like this to hold it in place, but you need to be very careful that it doesn't slip, or you can damage the clutch basket. Okay, so I have my clutch basket holder tool in place with all 6 dowels installed, and I'm ready to take the nut off now. And I'm going to use an air impact with a 27mm socket. If you don't have an air impact, you can use a breaker bar. And it comes off fairly easily with the air impact. If you're using a breaker bar, especially if it's the first time you've had the nut off, it's quite tough because high strength Loctite is used. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the washer, and then I can remove the dowels from the tool. And make sure you keep track of the dowels. You don't want one dropping down somewhere and you're not knowing about it. And then you can remove the inner clutch. And typically this comes off with a washer stuck to it, yeah. So you want to keep track of that washer. And then you can remove the outer clutch basket. Okay, so next some pre-assembly work is required. So you start with the shaft and you need to put the needle bearing on it and lubricate it up. So I'm using some gear oil. So I put some on the shaft first and then lube up the needle bearing. And then you can install the gear, which just slides over the needle bearing. Make sure that moves smoothly. Looks good. And next you install a washer, and then there's a lock ring. And it's fairly thin, and I think you can get it on with your fingers, so I'm going to try that. If that doesn't work, I shall use a tool. But yeah, it looks like it goes on pretty easily. And then just slide it down and make sure it clicks into place. I heard it click nicely. So that all looks good. And the next step is to install the ratchet wheel. And there's a marking. If you look carefully, there's a hole here. And that needs to align with the hole on the Kickstarter shaft here. So I'll show you once I put it on. So right now this hole lines up with this hole, so make sure the alignment is correct. And then holding it together, you can install the spring, and it has this part which goes into the hole on the shaft. Just slide that on there, and then flipping it over, you get the smaller spring and position that there. And that's the assembly of the shaft and gears complete. Okay, the next step is to install the stop piece, which fits in the case like this. And using the 2 bolts provided and applying some Loctite 243, you install them. And these need to be torqued to 10 Newton meters. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the Kickstarter shaft assembly, and this part needs to go under here, so you need to ensure that goes on correctly. And I've already put some oil underneath here. And turn it round, make sure it goes correctly. And then the spring under tension needs to go onto this part on the case. So there's a hole there, so you need to make sure it's pressed into it. like that. And then once it's in, make sure the tab is still under there, and also that there's a space evenly around. In the instruction manual it says to check the space under the spring. So that all looks good. And next I can install the idler gear, which goes on here. I've already lubed it up and I've put some oil on here. So I just slide that down into position, and then there's a washer that goes there, and then there's a snap ring. So you need some snap ring pliers to install that. And make sure it snaps into place. So that looks good. The clutch basket on. And then I can install the inner clutch basket, not forgetting this washer. And inside here you should note there's some rubber dampers, so 6 of them. And if you've got high hours, so I'd say certainly if it's got 100 hours on, they need replacing. So pull it apart, replace the rubbers. Mine's only got 5 hours, so I definitely don't need doing. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the nut and put the lock washer on. I always use a new one, and one is supplied in the kit. The nut needs to be torqued to 100 Newton meters. But it's a really good idea to clean out all of the old Loctite from the nut and also the thread. In my case, there was virtually none on the thread here, but in the nut there was a lot of old Loctite, and I couldn't actually put it on easily. So now I always do a test fit by hand to make sure it can screw on. And if it goes on by hand, you're certain that it's going to torque correctly. So that goes on fine by hand now, so I can be sure it will torque correctly. And to clean out the old Loctite from inside the nut, I use a pick tool like this. It's a little bit tedious, but it takes a few minutes, but you can do it really well. And the manual specifies to use Loctite 648, and I have some, so that's what I'm going to be using. It's a high strength Loctite. And you need to torque the nut to 100 Newton meters. And remove the clutch holding tool. And then you need to bend up the tabs of the lock washer, and I initially use a screwdriver just to get it started. And then I found that these Knipex wrench pliers work really well to do the final bending. Very easy to do. Okay, so that looks good. And next I'm going to install the clutch pack, and I'm putting in the dowels first. And now I'm going to install the plates. So the first one has the S, and that goes towards the engine. And when you take it off, make sure you keep everything in order. Don't mix up the orientation. So fiber plate orientation doesn't matter, but the metals do. They have a sharp edge and a rounded edge, and the metal plate thickness is different as well, so don't mix them up. And if you're not sure, you can reference the video that I made regarding the clutch inspection, and I detail the different thicknesses in that. Okay, so that's all of the metal and fiber plates installed. Then you can install the throwout, which just slides down the middle. Make sure it's seated correctly. And then you can install the pressure plate. Okay. And then you want to install this washer, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it has a top marking which is on the rounded edge, so it's pretty easy to understand, and that just sits on there. And then you can install the belleville spring and the tensioner, and make sure you select the correct adjustment. So mine came set at 2, so I'm going to put it back on 2. And the belleville spring tension bolts, you want to tighten in a crisscross pattern, which I'm doing the final bit now, just before I torque them. So the final torque is 6 Newton meters. Again, do it in a crisscross pattern. And then to check that the belleville spring is tensioned correctly, use a straight edge. You can use a steel rule and lie it across the edge of the belleville spring, and the spec is between 0 and 0.1 millimeters. And if you have a gap, mine looks really good, so it's pretty flat. But if you have a gap more than 0.1 millimeters, you'd need to make an adjustment. So if there's a gap at the outside, it means you need to apply more pressure or more tension to the spring. And if there's a gap in the middle, you're applying too much, so you need to back off on tension. And you can do that with a tension ring. Okay, so next I'm going to install my new gaskets. Be sure to wipe off any dirt that you see, and then you can install the new gasket. And then for the clutch cover, be sure to install the dowels. So there's 3 dowels, one there, one here, and one over here. And before you install the new gasket, make sure all the surfaces are clean. Okay, so that looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and install the new gasket. And before you install the clutch case, you need to remove the cover here and install a seal. So just using some snap ring pliers, remove the snap ring and then push out the cover. And then on the outside of the case, you need to install this seal. I'm going to use this press head, and I'm going to use my hydraulic press to actually install it, so I'll show that. So this is my 20-ton hydraulic press, which I'm going to be using to press the seal in. And sorry, I forgot to press record. The seal pressed in really easily with the hydraulic press, much easier than hammering. And you can see it's nice and flush. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the clutch cover, and double check the gasket is in place. You've got all 3 dowels in. That looks good. And also all the sealing surfaces need to be very clean. So all of that looks good. And then you have to feed the exhaust valve linkage through the clutch cover. Okay, so that looks good. And then you can position the clutch cover in place. And the Kickstarter shaft you want to feed through very carefully so you don't tear the seal. And I've put some silicone grease on the seal to help prevent any damage. Okay, that just slid on nicely. Okay. So don't force anything. Then I just turn the water pump a little bit and it's seated down. And before you start installing any of the screws, make sure that it is fully seated all the way around and there's no gaps. Okay, so the installation guide provides details of the tightening order of the clutch cover, and it says to install the water pump cover first and to install this screw and this screw. So I'm going to follow that. And the torque is 10 Newton meters. Next it says to install the coolant drain bolt, and I've put a new copper washer in. I think that's a really good idea, and that is torqued to 10 Newton meters as well. And next it says to install the screws number 25 in this diagram, but not to torque them, and then 26 and 27. And once all of the screws are installed, then to torque them in a crisscross pattern. So that's what I'm going to do. And you should note that the screws marked 27, so this one, and this one, are only torqued to 8 Newton meters. So, like I said, first you just hand tighten them, and then you go around and torque everything, but be sure to only torque these ones to 8 Newton meters. All the other ones are 10 Newton meters. Okay, I'm going to start torquing the case bolts. So, as I mentioned, the majority of them are 10 Newton meters, and I'm going to do a crisscross pattern. There's so many, there isn't really a very specific order, but just try and even it out. And then torque these ones to 8. So the one's numbered 27. Okay, so now we're ready to install the exhaust valve preload spring and adjuster. And the preload spring has 2 springs, so there's the outer one and the auxiliary inner one, much smaller, and this metal piece which engages in the lever. So make sure you have all those pieces, and it's a good idea to take the adjuster off so you can see that everything lines up correctly and engages properly. And that looks good. So now I get the adjuster. And I can use the screws. If you're interested in what the exhaust valve does and how it works, I have a separate video which I made recently, which goes into some detail, also how to set it up according to the KTM specification. So I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one if you're interested in that. And then torque these screws to 5 Newton meters, so it's quite low. And now you're ready to put the exhaust valve linkage back on. So make sure that snaps on properly. And then I'm going to use a cloth just in case I drop it. I'm just going to tuck it under here. And then the clip feeds into a hole on the underside of the ball, just like that, and then you just swivel it round and it clips on. And then you can install the exhaust valve cover, slide that down, and then the 3 screws. And these are very low torque, they're 4 Newton meters, so be careful not to over torque them. Again, it's really important to use the correct Torx bit. It's quite easy to select the wrong one and then you end up stripping the screw. So these are 25, Torx 25. And then torque to 4 Newton meters. And then you can reinstall the coolant hose. And be careful not to over tighten the hose clamps. They need to be secure, but they don't need to be super tight. And you can actually damage the hose if you tighten it too much. And now I'm ready to install the Kickstarter on the shaft. And I'm going to use some Moly 60 paste on the teeth because I know they can be difficult to remove afterwards. And I think this is a good idea. So I know Moly 60 is no longer available, so if you're buying some new, you'll have to find something else. But I use this on my counter shaft as well when installing the sprocket, and it helps reduce wear. Okay, so I've decided that I'm not actually going to install the bolt until I've got the exhaust on, so I can double check the Kickstarter doesn't interfere with anything. So I'm going to leave it like that for now and put the exhaust on. When refilling the coolant, after you put some coolant in, be sure to bleed the air out of the head. So you have to loosen the temp sensor. And I've unplugged it, so it's easy to turn around. And you basically carefully loosen it. And I can see some bubbles coming out. And you just wait until the bubbles stop and you start getting coolant coming out. Okay, I can see coolant now. If you don't do this, you'll have air trapped in the head and it won't cool properly. And as you can see, I put the exhaust back on and I've decided on this position. It doesn't interfere with the pipe at all. It should be fine. And the final part is to torque the screw to 25 Newton meters. I've already put some Loctite 243 medium strength on it. Works!